Hey, thanks for listening to Roanoke, an apocalyptic zombie adventure thriller. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a brand new audiobook each week. Chapter 1. The moon hung low over the settlement, casting long, twisted shadows that danced across the packed dirt paths between the houses. Smoke from cooking fires curled lazily into the night air, blending with the scent of pine and damp earth. The settlers of Roanoke moved quietly in the dim light, their voices low, their movements purposeful. Night in the wilderness demanded vigilance. The forest was a wall of black, filled with unknown dangers. In a modest cabin near the edge of the settlement, young Sarah Whitlock tugged a woolen blanket over her children. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its glow warming the small room. She paused to listen to the rhythmic chirping of crickets outside, a familiar sound that should have been comforting. Yet tonight, unease coiled in her stomach. Her husband, Thomas, was out on the night watch, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Across the village, James Pritchard, one of the settlement's guards, leaned against the stockade wall, his musket resting against his shoulder. He peered into the darkness beyond the wooden barriers, his eyes scanning for movement. The forest loomed like a living thing, its shadows deep and impenetrable. He had stood watch countless nights before, but tonight felt different. The usual nocturnal sounds seemed muted, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Pritchard shifted uneasily, glancing toward the faint glow of the village behind him. He was about to turn and make his rounds, when a faint rustling reached his ears. His grip tightened on his musket as he strained to pinpoint the source. The rustling grew louder, then stopped abruptly. Heart pounding, he called out, "Who goes there?" The response came in the form of an arrow slicing through the air. It struck the wall inches from his head. Before Pritchard could react, figures burst from the tree line, their war cries shattering the stillness. The attack began with a fury that left no time to think. Dozens of raiders surged forward, their torches lighting the night. They climbed over the stockade with practiced ease, their movements swift and deliberate. Pritchard fired his musket, the deafening crack briefly cutting through the chaos. One raider fell, but more took his place. Dropping the empty musket, Pritchard drew his blade and charged, determined to defend the village. In the Whitlock cabin, Sarah froze as the first screams reached her ears. The children stirred, their eyes wide with fear. She grabbed a long-handled axe from beside the hearth and pressed her back against the door, her heart racing. Outside, the sounds of battle intensified. The clash of steel, the shouts of men, the wails of the wounded. "Stay here," she whispered to the children. Her voice was steady, but inside she was trembling. Closer to the center of the village, the attackers moved with brutal efficiency. They broke down doors, dragging settlers from their homes. Women screamed as they were pulled into the night. Children clung to their mothers, and men fought desperately with whatever weapons they could find. The settlers were no match for the organized assault. Pritchard fought valiantly, slashing and parrying as raiders closed in around him. Blood slicked his hands, and his breaths came in ragged gasps. He took down one assailant, then another, but there were too many. An axe struck him from behind, and he fell to his knees. As the world blurred around him, he glimpsed the raiders carrying captives toward the forest. His last thought was of the family he had sworn to protect. Captain John Smith arrived moments too late. The raid had come and gone, leaving destruction in its wake. He dismounted his horse at the edge of the village, his eyes scanning the scene with grim determination. Fires burned where torches had been thrown onto thatched roofs. Doors hung from their hinges, and blood streaked the ground. Survivors emerged cautiously from their hiding places, their faces pale and their eyes filled with terror. Smith's lieutenant, a wiry man named Graves, approached, his face tight with anger. "They hit us hard, Captain. Took women and children. Killed Pritchard and at least 3 others." Smith nodded, his jaw clenched. He had seen this kind of devastation before, and he knew what it meant. "Gather the men. We leave at first light." Graves hesitated. And the village? Leave a skeleton guard, Smith ordered. We'll need every able-bodied man for the rescue. Those bastards won't get away with this. He turned his attention back to the wreckage, his mind already calculating the risks. The forest was vast and unforgiving, but he had no choice. The lives of the captives depended on swift action, and Smith had never been one to back down from a fight. As the villagers began to douse the flames and tend to the wounded, Smith stood silent, his gaze fixed on the dark line of trees where the attackers had disappeared. The sun would rise soon enough, but dawn would bring no peace. Only blood and vengeance lay ahead. The forest swallowed sound like a living thing. Beneath its canopy, the rescue party moved in silence, their boots crunching against the cold, damp earth. Captain John Smith led the way, his broad shoulders framed by the glint of his sword at his hip. Behind him, a wiry scout named Caleb Hyde moved with uncanny ease, his moccasins making no noise as he scanned the surroundings. "What do you think, Caleb?" Smith asked in a low voice, pausing to examine a faint scuff mark on the ground. The others halted behind him, their breath misting in the cool morning air. "They're not far," Caleb replied, kneeling to study the dirt. He pointed to a broken branch dangling low from a sapling. "This is fresh. Maybe an hour ahead." "They'll hear us before we reach them," Graves muttered, adjusting the musket slung across his shoulder. His jaw tightened as he glanced toward the deeper shadows of the forest. "And they'll have traps." Smith straightened, his expression resolute. "Then we'll be ready." Eyes sharp. Caleb led on. The group pressed forward, their tension palpable. Smith's gaze swept the forest constantly, noting every flicker of movement, every rustle of leaves. He had no patience for fear, but he could feel it gnawing at the edges of his resolve. They passed a rotting log, its surface slick with moss, and entered a clearing. The sun filtered through the trees in scattered beams, highlighting a cluster of stones in the center of the clearing. Caleb froze, his hand raised to halt the group. "What is it?" Graves hissed, gripping his musket tighter. Caleb gestured silently toward the stones. As the men moved closer, Smith saw what had given the scout pause. Blood. Dark congealed smears streaked the rocks and ground. Feathers, red and black, were scattered around a torn leather pouch. It was unmistakably a ritual site. "A warning," Caleb murmured. He knelt by the stones and picked up one of the feathers. "They know we're coming." "Good," Smith said sharply. "Let them fear us too. We keep moving." Graves glanced uneasily at the stones before following. "Fear doesn't matter much when they've got our people. How do you think they're treating the captives right now?" Smith stopped and turned, his gaze hard. "Keep your focus, Lieutenant. Every minute we waste is another minute they're alone. We'll get them back." Graves nodded curtly but said nothing more. They moved deeper into the forest, the terrain growing more treacherous. Thick roots rose like veins from the earth, and patches of mist clung to the low ground. Caleb crouched low, inspecting every inch of the trail. Smith's men whispered among themselves, their unease manifesting in fidgeting hands and darting eyes. After another hour of tracking, Caleb stopped suddenly. He held up his hand again, signaling silence. Smith approached quietly, crouching beside him. Caleb pointed to the ground ahead, where a series of shallow depressions marred the dirt. "Footprints," Caleb said. "They've split into two groups." Smith frowned, scanning the trails. "Why split?" "Diversion, most likely," Caleb replied. "To slow us down." Smith's fingers drummed against the hilt of his sword. He turned to Graves. "Take 4 men and follow the trail to the east. Caleb and I will take the other group. If you find the captives, don't wait for us. Get them out." Graves hesitated. "And if we find the raiders first?" Smith's gaze was cold. "You know what to do." Graves nodded and selected his men. They broke off toward the eastern trail, disappearing quickly into the undergrowth. Smith waited until they were gone before turning to Caleb. "Let's move," he said. The second trail led them into a dense thicket, the trees pressing close together like silent sentinels. The air was heavier here, the light dimmer. Caleb moved ahead, his bow drawn and an arrow nocked. Smith followed closely, his sword ready. They heard the faint murmur of voices before they saw the raiders. Crouching low, they crept forward until they could see the clearing beyond the thicket. A small camp had been hastily set up, with 2 teepees and a smoldering fire in the center. 3 raiders stood guard, their weapons at the ready, while 2 others knelt by a bound captive. Smith's jaw tightened. The captive was a young woman, her face bruised, her hands tied behind her back. She sat slumped against a tree, her breathing shallow. "We'll take the guards first," Smith whispered. "Quietly." Caleb nodded. He drew his bowstring back, the wood creaking softly. A moment later, the first arrow flew, striking one of the guards in the throat. The man fell without a sound. Smith moved quickly, dispatching the second guard with a single precise slash of his sword. The third raider turned, his eyes wide with shock, but Caleb's second arrow found its mark before he could cry out. The 2 remaining raiders by the captive scrambled to their feet, drawing their weapons. Smith stepped into the clearing, his sword raised. "Let her go," he commanded. One of the raiders sneered, brandishing a tomahawk. "You'll die here, white man." Smith didn't wait for him to attack. He lunged forward, his sword meeting the tomahawk in a clash of steel and wood. Caleb circled around, drawing his knife. The second raider charged at him, but Caleb sidestepped smoothly, slashing across the man's side. The raider fell with a grunt. Smith's opponent was faster than expected, but he was no match for the captain's skill. Smith disarmed him with a brutal strike, then ran him through. The man crumpled to the ground, his blood soaking the dirt. Caleb wiped his blade clean on the raider's tunic and moved to untie the captive. The woman's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at Smith with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "You're safe now," Smith said, his voice firm but gentle. "What's your name?" "Mary," she whispered. "Mary Winslow." "Mary, can you walk?" Caleb asked as he helped her to her feet. She nodded weakly. "I think so." Smith turned to Caleb. "We'll take her back to the village. Graves can handle the other group." Caleb nodded, but his expression was grim. "If they don't, we'll have more blood to answer for." Smith sheathed his sword and took Mary's arm to steady her. "Then let's hope Graves is as capable as he says he is." As they made their way back through the forest, the weight of their task settled heavily on Smith's shoulders. The fight was far from over, and he knew the worst was yet to come. Chapter 2. The forest swallowed sound like a living thing. Beneath its canopy, the rescue party moved in silence, their boots crunching against the cold, damp earth. Captain John Smith led the way, his broad shoulders framed by the glint of his sword at his hip. Behind him, a wiry scout named Caleb Ghostwriter moved with uncanny ease, his moccasins making no noise as he scanned the surroundings. "What do you think, Caleb?" Smith asked in a low voice, pausing to examine a faint scuff mark on the ground. The others halted behind him, their breath misting in the cool morning air. "They're not far," Caleb replied, kneeling to study the dirt. He pointed to a broken branch dangling low from a sapling. "This is fresh. Maybe an hour ahead." "They'll hear us before we reach them," Graves muttered, adjusting the musket slung across his shoulder. His jaw tightened as he glanced toward the deeper shadows of the forest. "And they'll have traps." Smith straightened, his expression resolute. "Then we'll be ready." Eyes sharp. Caleb led on. The group pressed forward, their tension palpable. Smith's gaze swept the forest constantly, noting every flicker of movement, every rustle of leaves. He had no patience for fear, but he could feel it gnawing at the edges of his resolve. They passed a rotting log, its surface slick with moss, and entered a clearing. The sun filtered through the trees in scattered beams, highlighting a cluster of stones in the center of the clearing. Caleb froze, his hand raised to halt the group. "What is it?" Graves hissed, gripping his musket tighter. Caleb gestured silently toward the stones. As the men moved closer, Smith saw what had given the scout pause. Blood. Dark congealed smears streaked the rocks and ground. Feathers, red and black, were scattered around a torn leather pouch. It was unmistakably a ritual site. "A warning," Caleb murmured. He knelt by the stones and picked up one of the feathers. "They know we're coming." "Good," Smith said sharply. "Let them fear us too. We keep moving." Graves glanced uneasily at the stones before following. "Fear doesn't matter much when they've got our people. How do you think they're treating the captives right now?" Smith stopped and turned, his gaze hard. "Keep your focus, Lieutenant. Every minute we waste is another minute they're alone. We'll get them back." Graves nodded curtly but said nothing more. They moved deeper into the forest, the terrain growing more treacherous. Thick roots rose like veins from the earth, and patches of mist clung to the low ground. Caleb crouched low, inspecting every inch of the trail. Smith's men whispered among themselves, their unease manifesting in fidgeting hands and darting eyes. After another hour of tracking, Caleb stopped suddenly. He held up his hand again, signaling silence. Smith approached quietly, crouching beside him. Caleb pointed to the ground ahead, where a series of shallow depressions marred the dirt. "Footprints," Caleb said. "They've split into two groups." Smith frowned, scanning the trails. "Why split?" "Diversion, most likely," Caleb replied. "To slow us down." Smith's fingers drummed against the hilt of his sword. He turned to Graves. "Take 4 men and follow the trail to the east. Caleb and I will take the other group. If you find the captives, don't wait for us. Get them out." Graves hesitated. "And if we find the raiders first?" Smith's gaze was cold. "You know what to do." Graves nodded and selected his men. They broke off toward the eastern trail, disappearing quickly into the undergrowth. Smith waited until they were gone before turning to Caleb. "Let's move," he said. The second trail led them into a dense thicket, the trees pressing close together like silent sentinels. The air was heavier here, the light dimmer. Caleb moved ahead, his bow drawn and an arrow nocked. Smith followed closely, his sword ready. They heard the faint murmur of voices before they saw the raiders. Crouching low, they crept forward until they could see the clearing beyond the thicket. A small camp had been hastily set up, with 2 teepees and a smoldering fire in the center. 3 raiders stood guard, their weapons at the ready, while 2 others knelt by a bound captive. Smith's jaw tightened. The captive was a young woman, her face bruised, her hands tied behind her back. She sat slumped against a tree, her breathing shallow. "We'll take the guards first," Smith whispered. "Quietly." Caleb nodded. He drew his bowstring back, the wood creaking softly. A moment later, the first arrow flew, striking one of the guards in the throat. The man fell without a sound. Smith moved quickly, dispatching the second guard with a single precise slash of his sword. The third raider turned, his eyes wide with shock, but Caleb's second arrow found its mark before he could cry out. The 2 remaining raiders by the captive scrambled to their feet, drawing their weapons. Smith stepped into the clearing, his sword raised. "Let her go," he commanded. One of the raiders sneered, brandishing a tomahawk. "You'll die here, white man." Smith didn't wait for him to attack. He lunged forward, his sword meeting the tomahawk in a clash of steel and wood. Caleb circled around, drawing his knife. The second raider charged at him, but Caleb sidestepped smoothly, slashing across the man's side. The raider fell with a grunt. Smith's opponent was faster than expected, but he was no match for the captain's skill. Smith disarmed him with a brutal strike, then ran him through. The man crumpled to the ground, his blood soaking the dirt. Caleb wiped his blade clean on the raider's tunic and moved to untie the captive. The woman's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at Smith with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "You're safe now," Smith said, his voice firm but gentle. "What's your name?" "Mary," she whispered. "Mary Winslow." "Mary, can you walk?" Caleb asked as he helped her to her feet. She nodded weakly. "I think so." Smith turned to Caleb. "We'll take her back to the village. Graves can handle the other group." Caleb nodded, but his expression was grim. "If they don't, we'll have more blood to answer for." Smith sheathed his sword and took Mary's arm to steady her. "Then let's hope Graves is as capable as he says he is." As they made their way back through the forest, the weight of their task settled heavily on Smith's shoulders. The fight was far from over, and he knew the worst was yet to come. Chapter 3. Night had fallen by the time Captain John Smith and his rescue party returned to Roanoke. The settlement's torches flickered weakly against the encroaching darkness, casting long, jittery shadows over the muddy streets. A tension hung heavy in the air, amplified by the somber expressions of the men left behind. "Captain." A young man ran to meet them, his face pale and his breaths labored. "It's the gate guard, sir." He heard screams from the forest. "Said it's something unnatural." Smith exchanged a quick glance with Caleb Hyde, who tightened his grip on the bow slung over his shoulder. "What kind of screams?" Smith asked sharply. The young man shook his head, his voice trembling. Like nothing human. It carried on the wind. Sent shivers straight through me." Mary Winslow, who had managed to remain quiet through the journey back, suddenly spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper. "They're coming." Smith turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Who?" She didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the forest behind them, as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. "Caleb," Smith said, his tone urgent. "Post extra guards along the perimeter. And make sure the torches stay lit." Caleb nodded, already moving toward the gate. "On it." Smith turned to the remaining men. "The rest of you, gather every able-bodied settler. I want everyone armed and ready. If they're bringing the fight to us, we'll meet them head-on." Inside the wooden stockade, the villagers hurried to follow orders. The sound of hurried footsteps mixed with the creak of muskets being loaded and the occasional barked command. Smith stood near the central fire, his eyes scanning the growing crowd. Graves approached, his musket slung over his shoulder. "I've counted 27 men fit to fight. The rest are either too old, too young, or too frightened to hold a weapon." 27 against how many?" Smith asked. Graves grimaced. "That's the question, isn't it? We don't even know what we're fighting." "We'll know soon enough," Smith replied. He stepped up onto a wooden crate, raising his voice to address the villagers. "Listen up. Tonight, we're not just defending ourselves. We're defending our families, our homes, and everything we've built here. Whatever comes out of those woods, we stand together. Do you hear me?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, subdued but steady. Smith nodded. "Good. I want torches placed along the walls. If you see anything move, call it out. And remember, aim for the chest. Make every shot count." Hours passed. The forest loomed, a black wall beyond the flickering light of the settlement's defenses. Smith and Caleb stood atop the wooden palisade, their eyes fixed on the darkness. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant call of an owl. "You ever seen anything like this?" Smith asked quietly. Caleb shook his head. "No. But my grandfather used to tell stories. He said, there are things in the woods older than any of us. Things best left undisturbed." Smith snorted softly. "I don't have the luxury of believing in ghost stories, Caleb. But whatever's out there, it's real enough to kill." Before Caleb could respond, a low guttural sound echoed from the forest. It wasn't a scream, nor was it an animal cry. It was something between a growl and a moan, deep and resonant. The men along the walls froze, their knuckles whitening around their weapons. What in God's name was that? Graves whispered, appearing at Smith's side. "Hold your positions," Smith commanded, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. "Stay sharp." Then they saw it. Movement at the edge of the firelight. Shapes shambled forward, their motions unnatural and jerky. At first they looked like men, but as they drew closer, it became clear they were anything but. "Good Lord," Caleb breathed. The figures were gaunt, their skin pale and mottled with decay. Eyes clouded and lifeless. They stumbled forward, as if drawn by some unseen force, their mouths hanging open to emit low guttural moans. "Open fire!" Smith shouted. The crack of muskets shattered the night. Lead balls tore through the air, striking the advancing figures. Some fell, crumpling to the ground, but others barely seemed to notice. They kept coming, relentless, stepping over their fallen kin. "Aim for the head," Caleb shouted, loosing an arrow that struck one of the creatures through the skull. It collapsed instantly, confirming his grim hypothesis. Smith drew his pistol, taking careful aim before firing. The shot hit its mark, dropping another creature. He reloaded quickly, his movements practiced and precise. Keep them away from the walls. The creatures, zombies for lack of a better term, clawed at the wooden palisade, their nails scraping against the rough timber. A few managed to grab hold of the edges, hauling themselves upward. One of the guards stabbed down with a pike, impaling a zombie through the chest. It let out a horrible groan, but didn't stop. "The head," Caleb repeated, pulling another arrow from his quiver. Smith grabbed a torch from a nearby sconce and hurled it over the wall. It landed among the zombies, igniting the dry leaves and branches scattered across the ground. The flames roared to life, illuminating the creatures in ghastly detail. The fire drove some of them back, but not enough. "We can't hold them forever," Graves yelled, sweat pouring down his face as he reloaded his musket. Smith gritted his teeth. "Then we buy ourselves time." He turned to Caleb. "Find the women and children. Get them to the central hall and barricade it. If the walls fall, that'll be our last stand." Caleb nodded and disappeared into the chaos. Smith reloaded his pistol, firing again into the horde. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and burning flesh. Screams and moans blended into a cacophony of terror. "Captain," one of the guards called out. "They're breaking through." Smith turned to see a section of the wall splintering under the weight of the creatures. He cursed under his breath, drawing his sword. "Fall back to the second line." The defenders retreated, forming a tighter perimeter around the central area of the settlement. Smith stood at the front, his sword flashing in the firelight as he cut down any creature that got too close. Graves stood beside him, his musket discarded in favor of a hatchet. "We can't keep this up," Graves panted, his swings growing slower with each strike. Smith didn't answer. His mind raced, searching for any solution, any chance to turn the tide. Then he heard it, a scream from behind. He spun around to see one of the villagers, a young boy, being dragged into the shadows by a zombie. "No!" Smith roared, breaking away from the line to chase after the boy. He reached the creature in 2 swift strides, severing its head with a powerful swing. The boy scrambled away, tears streaming down his face. "Get to the hall," Smith ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. The boy nodded and ran, disappearing into the safety of the barricade. Smith turned back to the fight, his resolve hardened. They would survive this night. They had to. Chapter 4. The aftermath of the night's attack left Roanoke trembling on the edge of despair. Smoke hung low over the village, curling upward from the burnt remnants of barricades. Villagers moved like ghosts, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. The scent of charred wood and blood filled the air, mingling with the distant cries of those still mourning their losses. Captain John Smith stood at the center of the settlement, his jaw tight and his hands clenched behind his back. He surveyed the damage, his sharp gaze catching every broken plank, every shattered window. Caleb Hyde approached, his bow slung over his shoulder, and a grim expression shadowing his face. "It's worse than I thought," Caleb said, stopping beside him. Smith nodded. "How many did we lose?" 9 dead, Caleb replied. 5 wounded. One of them won't last the day." Smith exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "The walls won't hold if they come again. We'll need to rebuild before nightfall." "And the wood?" Caleb asked. Smith turned toward the forest. "We'll have to risk it. Gather a team. I want men with sharp eyes and steady hands. No one ventures far, and no one moves alone." "Understood." Caleb hesitated, then added, "The people are scared, John. They're starting to ask questions. They want to know what's hunting us." Smith's face hardened. "Tell them what they need to hear. We're hunting it now." The work party set out mid-morning, a dozen men armed with axes, muskets, and grim determination. The forest pressed close around them, its canopy thick and its underbrush alive with unseen movement. Every snap of a twig set their nerves on edge. "Stick together," Caleb reminded them as he moved through the group. "Eyes up. Ears open. If you see anything, call out." Graves carried an axe over one shoulder, his other hand gripping a musket. "I don't like this," he muttered to the man beside him. "Feels like we're walking into a trap." "You think the captain doesn't know that?" The other man replied. "Just keep your mouth shut and your musket ready." They reached a clearing and immediately set to work. Axes bit into trees, their sharp reports echoing through the woods. Caleb stood watch at the edge of the group, his bow at the ready, his eyes scanning the shadows. "How much longer?" Graves called over, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. "Until we have enough," Caleb answered without looking back. "Stay focused." The sound came suddenly, a faint rustling that didn't belong. Caleb froze, his head snapping toward the source. "Quiet," he hissed, holding up a hand. The men stopped, their axes falling silent. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every sound amplified in the stillness. Then it came again, closer this time, the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. "Form up," Caleb ordered, notching an arrow. The men gathered quickly, their muskets raised as they scanned the trees. A figure emerged from the shadows, stumbling into the clearing. It was a woman, her dress torn and her face streaked with dirt. She looked up at them with wide, terrified eyes. "Help me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Stay back," Caleb warned, keeping his bow trained on her. "Who are you? What happened?" The woman took another step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural. That's when they saw it, the blood smeared around her mouth, the unnatural pallor of her skin. Her lips pulled back into a grotesque snarl, revealing teeth stained red. "Shoot!" Caleb shouted. The muskets fired as one, the deafening roar shaking the clearing. The woman's body jerked violently, then collapsed to the ground. For a moment, there was silence. "What the hell was that?" Graves demanded, his voice shaking. Caleb didn't answer. He moved forward cautiously, his bow still drawn. When he reached the body, he nudged it with his foot. It didn't move. "Reload," he ordered, his voice tight. "We're not alone out here." As the men fumbled with their powder and shot, more movement came from the trees. This time, it wasn't just one figure. Shadows shifted, dozens of them, stepping into the clearing with the same jerky gait. "Back to the village," Caleb yelled. "Now." The men didn't hesitate. They abandoned their tools and sprinted for the settlement, the sound of shambling footsteps growing louder behind them. Caleb stayed at the rear, loosing arrows as he ran. Each shot found its mark, but the creatures kept coming, their numbers growing with every passing moment. The gates of Roanoke slammed shut just as the first of the creatures reached the walls. Smith was there, his sword drawn and his voice rising above the chaos. "Get to your stations. Hold the line." The men scrambled to the battlements, muskets and bows at the ready. The creatures threw themselves against the wooden palisade, their rotting hands clawing at the timber. The defenders fired down into the horde, the air filled with the crack of gunfire and the hiss of arrows. "Caleb," Smith shouted, running to his side. "What happened out there?" "We were ambushed," Caleb replied, breathing hard. "They're everywhere, John. It's like they're spreading." Smith's jaw tightened. "Get inside. See to the wounded. I'll hold them here." "You can't fight them all," Caleb argued. "We don't have a choice," Smith said firmly. "Go." Caleb hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the chaos. Smith turned back to the fight, his sword flashing in the firelight as he joined the defenders on the wall. Below them, the creatures swarmed, their lifeless eyes fixed on the living. Inside the central hall, Caleb found the wounded gathered on makeshift beds. Mary Winslow moved among them, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We're running out of bandages," she said without looking up. "And I don't know how much more we can do for them." Caleb knelt beside one of the wounded men, his face pale and slick with sweat. The man's eyes fluttered open, and he grabbed Caleb's arm with surprising strength. "They don't stop," he whispered. "You have to burn them. It's the only way." Caleb nodded, his throat tight. "We'll stop them," he promised. The man's grip loosened, and his eyes closed for the last time. Caleb stood, his jaw clenched. He turned to Mary. "Keep everyone here. If the walls fall, this is our last line of defense." She nodded, her expression resolute. "Be careful out there." Caleb didn't answer. He stepped back outside, the sound of the battle filling his ears. The night wasn't over, and neither was the fight. Chapter 5. The sun had barely crested the horizon, its weak light doing little to chase away the chill that clung to the village. Roanoke's defenses stood battered, but intact after the long night. Inside the meeting hall, Captain John Smith sat at the head of a roughly hewn wooden table. Around him, the remaining village leaders gathered, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. "We need more than muskets and walls," Caleb Hyde said, leaning forward. "We need to figure out what's causing this." "What's causing it is those creatures," Graves snapped, his voice rising. "And they'll tear through us again, if we don't reinforce the stockade." "Reinforce it with what?" Mary Winslow's calm tone cut through the tension. She stood at the edge of the room, her arms crossed. "We've used every scrap of wood within 100 yards of the village. Unless you plan on cutting down trees with your bare hands, we need another solution." "Then we hunt them down," Smith said, his voice firm. "We don't wait for them to come to us. We find their source and end this." The room fell silent. Finally, Caleb spoke. "You mean, go into the forest?" "We don't have a choice," Smith replied. "The longer we sit here, the stronger they get. We need answers. Caleb, you know these woods better than anyone. Can you track them?" Caleb hesitated, his eyes flicking to the others in the room. "I can try. But it won't be easy. They're not natural. Their movements don't follow any patterns I've seen before." "Then we'll adapt," Smith said. "Graves, you're coming too. Mary, I need you to hold the village together while we're gone." Mary frowned. "How long will you be away?" "As long as it takes," Smith answered. He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "We leave within the hour. Gather your gear." The forest was a different beast in daylight. The tangled underbrush and towering trees seemed to close in on the small group as they moved cautiously through the woods. Caleb led the way, his bow in hand and his eyes scanning every shadow. Smith followed close behind, his musket at the ready. Graves brought up the rear, grumbling under his breath. "This is madness," Graves said after a while. "We're walking straight into their territory. Would you rather wait for them to come to us?" Smith shot back without looking over his shoulder. Graves muttered something unintelligible, but kept walking. The group pressed on, their boots crunching softly on the forest floor. "Tracks?" Caleb said suddenly, crouching down. He pointed to a series of deep impressions in the dirt, leading deeper into the woods. "Human?" Smith asked. Caleb shook his head. "Too heavy. Too irregular. These belong to something else." "Then we're on the right path," Smith said. "Let's move." They followed the trail for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker and more oppressive the deeper they went. The air became thick, carrying a faint, sickly sweet odor that made Graves gag. "What is that?" he asked, covering his nose with his sleeve. Caleb's face was grim. "Death." The trail led them to a clearing, where the ground was littered with bones and rotting flesh. Buzzing flies swarmed the air, their incessant droning adding to the scene's horror. "Dear God," Graves whispered, his face pale. "What is this place?" "A feeding ground," Caleb said, his voice tight. "They drag their kills here." Smith stepped forward, his eyes scanning the clearing. "Keep your guard up. This is where they—" A sudden rustling from the far side of the clearing cut him off. The group turned, weapons raised, as a figure emerged from the trees. It was a man, or at least it had been. Its skin was gray and mottled, its eyes lifeless. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its head twitching as it locked onto them. "Steady," Smith said, raising his musket. "Wait for my signal." More figures appeared behind the first, shambling into the clearing. Their numbers grew quickly, and soon a dozen of the creatures stood before them. "We can't fight them all," Graves said, panic creeping into his voice. "Hold your ground," Smith ordered. "Aim for the head." The creatures charged, their guttural moans filling the air. Smith fired first, his shot taking down the lead zombie. Caleb followed, loosing an arrow that struck another between the eyes. Graves hesitated, his musket shaking in his hands. "Graves," Smith barked. "Now." Graves pulled the trigger, his shot going wide. He cursed and scrambled to reload as the creatures closed in. "Fall back," Smith shouted. "To the trees." The group retreated, firing as they went. Caleb's arrows flew with deadly precision, each one finding its mark. Smith reloaded his musket with practiced speed, taking down another creature with each shot. Graves lagged behind, his fear slowing him down. "Move, damn it!" Smith yelled, grabbing Graves by the arm and pulling him forward. They reached the tree line and turned to make a stand. The creatures stumbled after them, their movements clumsy but relentless. Smith drew his sword, slashing at the first zombie that came within reach. Caleb switched to his tomahawk, his strikes quick and efficient. "Graves, cover our flank," Smith ordered. Graves fumbled with his musket, finally managing to fire a shot that brought down one of the creatures. He grabbed a fallen branch and swung it wildly, his strikes more desperate than effective. The fight was brutal and chaotic, but eventually the last of the creatures fell. The group stood in the aftermath, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Blood and ichor stained their clothes, and the stench was overwhelming. "Is that all of them?" Graves asked, his voice trembling. Caleb shook his head. "Not likely. This was just a hunting party." Smith wiped his sword on the grass and sheathed it. "Then we keep moving. We're not stopping until we find their source." Graves stared at him, incredulous. "You want to keep going? After that?" Smith fixed him with a steely gaze. "If we don't, this village is as good as dead. Now pull yourself together." Caleb stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "The trail leads north. Whatever we're looking for, it's deeper in the forest." Smith nodded. "Then that's where we're headed. Let's move." The group pressed on, their steps heavy but determined. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker with each passing hour. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Not until they found the source of the nightmare that had come to Roanoke. Chapter 6. The aftermath of the night's attack left Roanoke trembling on the edge of despair. Smoke hung low over the village, curling upward from the burnt remnants of barricades. Villagers moved like ghosts, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. The scent of charred wood and blood filled the air, mingling with the distant cries of those still mourning their losses. Captain John Smith stood at the center of the settlement, his jaw tight and his hands clenched behind his back. He surveyed the damage, his sharp gaze catching every broken plank, every shattered window. Caleb Hyde approached, his bow slung over his shoulder, and a grim expression shadowing his face. "It's worse than I thought," Caleb said, stopping beside him. Smith nodded. "How many did we lose?" "9 dead," Caleb replied. 5 wounded. One of them won't last the day." Smith exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "The walls won't hold if they come again. We'll need to rebuild before nightfall." "And the wood?" Caleb asked. Smith turned toward the forest. "We'll have to risk it. Gather a team. I want men with sharp eyes and steady hands. No one ventures far, and no one moves alone." "Understood." Caleb hesitated, then added, "The people are scared, John. They're starting to ask questions. They want to know what's hunting us." Smith's face hardened. "Tell them what they need to hear. We're hunting it now." The work party set out mid-morning, a dozen men armed with axes, muskets, and grim determination. The forest pressed close around them, its canopy thick and its underbrush alive with unseen movement. Every snap of a twig set their nerves on edge. "Stick together," Caleb reminded them as he moved through the group. "Eyes up. Ears open. If you see anything, call out." Graves carried an axe over one shoulder, his other hand gripping a musket. "I don't like this," he muttered to the man beside him. "Feels like we're walking into a trap." "You think the captain doesn't know that?" the other man replied. "Just keep your mouth shut and your musket ready." They reached a clearing and immediately set to work. Axes bit into trees, their sharp reports echoing through the woods. Caleb stood watch at the edge of the group, his bow at the ready, his eyes scanning the shadows. "How much longer?" Graves called over, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. "Until we have enough," Caleb answered without looking back. "Stay focused." The sound came suddenly, a faint rustling that didn't belong. Caleb froze, his head snapping toward the source. "Quiet," he hissed, holding up a hand. The men stopped, their axes falling silent. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every sound amplified in the stillness. Then it came again, closer this time, the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. "Form up," Caleb ordered, notching an arrow. The men gathered quickly, their muskets raised as they scanned the trees. A figure emerged from the shadows, stumbling into the clearing. It was a woman, her dress torn and her face streaked with dirt. She looked up at them with wide, terrified eyes. "Help me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Stay back," Caleb warned, keeping his bow trained on her. "Who are you? What happened?" The woman took another step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural. That's when they saw it, the blood smeared around her mouth, the unnatural pallor of her skin. Her lips pulled back into a grotesque snarl, revealing teeth stained red. "Shoot!" Caleb shouted. The muskets fired as one, the deafening roar shaking the clearing. The woman's body jerked violently, then collapsed to the ground. For a moment, there was silence. "What the hell was that?" Graves demanded, his voice shaking. Caleb didn't answer. He moved forward cautiously, his bow still drawn. When he reached the body, he nudged it with his foot. It didn't move. "Reload," he ordered, his voice tight. "We're not alone out here." As the men fumbled with their powder and shot, more movement came from the trees. This time, it wasn't just one figure. Shadows shifted, dozens of them, stepping into the clearing with the same jerky gait. "Back to the village," Caleb yelled. "Now." The men didn't hesitate. They abandoned their tools and sprinted for the settlement, the sound of shambling footsteps growing louder behind them. Caleb stayed at the rear, loosing arrows as he ran. Each shot found its mark, but the creatures kept coming, their numbers growing with every passing moment. The gates of Roanoke slammed shut just as the first of the creatures reached the walls. Smith was there, his sword drawn and his voice rising above the chaos. "Get to your stations. Hold the line." The men scrambled to the battlements, muskets and bows at the ready. The creatures threw themselves against the wooden palisade, their rotting hands clawing at the timber. The defenders fired down into the horde, the air filled with the crack of gunfire and the hiss of arrows. "Caleb," Smith shouted, running to his side. "What happened out there?" "We were ambushed," Caleb replied, breathing hard. "They're everywhere, John. It's like they're spreading." Smith's jaw tightened. "Get inside. See to the wounded. I'll hold them here." "You can't fight them all," Caleb argued. "We don't have a choice," Smith said firmly. "Go." Caleb hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the chaos. Smith turned back to the fight, his sword flashing in the firelight as he joined the defenders on the wall. Below them, the creatures swarmed, their lifeless eyes fixed on the living. Inside the central hall, Caleb found the wounded gathered on makeshift beds. Mary Winslow moved among them, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We're running out of bandages," she said without looking up. "And I don't know how much more we can do for them." Caleb knelt beside one of the wounded men, his face pale and slick with sweat. The man's eyes fluttered open, and he grabbed Caleb's arm with surprising strength. "They don't stop," he whispered. "You have to burn them. It's the only way." Caleb nodded, his throat tight. "We'll stop them," he promised. The man's grip loosened, and his eyes closed for the last time. Caleb stood, his jaw clenched. He turned to Mary. "Keep everyone here. If the walls fall, this is our last line of defense." She nodded, her expression resolute. "Be careful out there." Caleb didn't answer. He stepped back outside, the sound of the battle filling his ears. The night wasn't over, and neither was the fight. Chapter 7. The forest canopy pressed heavily above them, its branches like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. Captain John Smith, Caleb Hyde, and Graves trudged through the dense foliage, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. Their earlier clash with the creatures had left them weary but resolute. Every step was a gamble, the shadows threatening to spring to life at any moment. Caleb held up a hand, halting their progress. "Smoke," he said, sniffing the air. He pointed toward the faint wisp curling through the treetops. "That's their camp." Graves swallowed hard, his grip tightening on his musket. "We're walking into a hornet's nest." "We need answers," Smith replied, his voice low but firm. "Stay quiet." They crept closer, the sounds of the forest replaced by murmured voices and the crackling of a fire. The clearing came into view, and with it the Indian camp. Teepees formed a loose circle around the fire, where several warriors sat, speaking in hushed tones. Women tended to cooking pots, while children darted between the tents, laughing and chasing each other. It was a scene of normalcy, starkly at odds with the horrors that had unfolded in the village. "This isn't right," Caleb murmured. "They don't look like they've been near the infected." "Then what's their connection?" Smith asked. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the camp. "We're missing something." Graves shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just leave. They haven't attacked us yet." Caleb turned to him, his expression hard. "We don't leave until we understand. If they're not infected, They might still know what's happening. Smith nodded. Let's approach carefully. Caleb, you're with me. Graves, stay back and cover us. Graves opened his mouth to protest, but closed it again at Smith's stern look. Fine. Just don't get yourselves killed. Smith and Caleb stepped into the clearing, their hands raised in a gesture of peace. The warriors by the fire stiffened, reaching for their weapons. A tall man with a feathered headdress stood and barked a command in his native tongue. The warriors lowered their hands but didn't relax. We mean no harm, Smith said, his voice steady. We need to speak with your chief. The man in the headdress stepped forward, his dark eyes studying them intently. I am Waya, leader of this camp. Why are you here, Captain? Smith hesitated. The man knew his name. We've come seeking answers. Our village was attacked by creatures. We believe they came from these woods. Waya's expression darkened. You speak of the cursed ones. Caleb stepped forward. What do you know about them? Waya's gaze flicked to Caleb, then back to Smith. They are not of our making. The sickness began after your people came. It spreads like fire, leaving death in its wake. Then we're on the same side, Smith said. Help us stop it. Waya hesitated, then gestured toward a nearby teepee. Come. I will show you. Inside the teepee, the air was thick with the pungent smell of herbs and smoke. A woman lay on a bed of furs, her skin pale and slick with sweat. Her breaths came in ragged gasps. Beside her, an older man, clearly a shaman, murmured incantations as he ground leaves into a paste. This is my sister, Waya said quietly. She fell ill 2 nights ago. What caused it? Caleb asked. Waya gestured toward the corner of the tent, where a worn blanket lay folded. That. It was found near the edge of your settlement. Smith knelt by the blanket, careful not to touch it. An infected blanket. Waya nodded grimly. It carries the sickness. Those who touch it fall ill. The sickness changes them. Caleb's jaw tightened. This wasn't an accident. Someone wanted this to happen. Smith stood, his expression grim. We'll take it back to the village. Maybe we can learn how to stop the spread. You will take nothing, Waya said sharply. This sickness is your people's doing. You will leave now. Smith held up his hands. We're trying to help. You've done enough. Waya snapped. Leave or I will not stop my warriors. Smith glanced at Caleb, who gave a small nod. We're leaving, Smith said. But this isn't over. Back in the forest, Smith's mood was dark. Someone in our village is responsible for this. Someone who wanted to weaponize the sickness, Caleb said. But why? Graves, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Does it matter why? We have to warn the others. If that sickness spreads in the village. It won't, Smith said. Not if we stop it first. As they moved deeper into the woods, the faint sound of laughter reached their ears. Smith froze, his hand going to his sword. What was that? They followed the sound to a small stream, where a young boy played in the water. He looked up as they approached, his face lighting up with a smile. Hello. Smith frowned. What are you doing out here, boy? Where are your parents? The boy pointed upstream. Back at camp. Mama said I could play. Smith exchanged a look with Caleb. Is your camp nearby? The boy nodded. Just over there. He pointed through the trees. We'll take him back, Caleb said. It's not safe out here. As they approached the camp, the boy suddenly stumbled, falling to his knees. Smith rushed to his side, but the boy pushed him away. I'm fine, he said, though his voice sounded weaker. Just tired. Smith's concern deepened, as he noticed the boy's skin had taken on a faint grayish tint. We need to get him back to his parents. Now. But as they reached the camp, a scream tore through the air. They broke into a run, bursting into the clearing just in time to see a man collapse, blood pouring from a bite wound on his neck. The boy's mother cradled him, sobbing, as the shaman rushed forward. "He bit his father," she cried. "My son bit him." Smith felt a cold dread settle in his chest. "Caleb," he said, his voice tight, "get everyone away from the injured." "It's too late," Caleb said, his voice grim. "The sickness has already spread." Chapter 8. The stillness of the forest was deceptive. Even as Captain John Smith and his men retreated toward Roanoke, the weight of their discoveries pressed against them. The infected blanket, the boy who turned on his father, and the whispered warning from Waya, "This sickness is your people's doing." Smith pushed ahead, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "We need to get that information back to the village. Every second we're out here, we're risking an ambush." "I'll say this," Graves muttered, keeping a watchful eye on the trees. "The woods aren't as quiet as they used to be." Caleb Hyde, walking at Smith's side, scanned the undergrowth. "It's not just the sounds. It's the feeling. Like the trees are watching." "Enough with your superstitions," Graves snapped. "We've got bigger problems than spooky forests." Smith shot him a warning look. "Quiet. Both of you. Save it for the village." The path narrowed as they approached a rocky outcrop. Caleb stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. "Wait." Graves groaned. "What now?" "Listen." For a moment, none of them moved. Then, faint and far off, came the sound of a scream. It echoed through the trees, rising and falling like the cry of a wounded animal. "That's no animal," Caleb said grimly. He unslung his bow, fitting an arrow to the string. Graves looked back the way they'd come. "We don't need to investigate. That's not why we're here." Smith ignored him. "It came from the east." "That's the direction of the Indian camp," Caleb said. "It could be them." "Or it could be something else entirely," Graves said. "Something we don't want to run into." Smith tightened his grip on his sword. "We're not leaving until we know what's out there. Stay close." They moved quickly but cautiously, the forest growing darker as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The scream came again, closer this time, followed by a guttural growling sound that made the hair on the back of Smith's neck stand on end. The underbrush gave way to a small clearing. Smith stopped short, his breath catching in his throat. Bodies lay scattered across the grass, blood pooling beneath them. Some were warriors from Wahia's camp. Others were women and children. "Dear God," Graves whispered, his face pale. Caleb knelt beside one of the bodies, his expression grim. "They've been torn apart. Look at the wounds, teeth marks." Smith's jaw tightened. The sickness has reached them. A low, rasping moan cut through the air. One of the fallen warriors began to stir, his hands clawing at the ground as he dragged himself upright. His face was twisted, his eyes milky and unfocused. Blood dripped from his lips. Graves stumbled back, raising his musket. He's one of them." "Hold your fire," Smith barked. He stepped forward, his sword drawn. "Stay behind me." The creature lunged, faster than Smith expected. He sidestepped, bringing his sword down in a clean arc. The blade bit into the creature's neck, severing its head. The body crumpled to the ground, twitching. "Did that stop it?" Graves asked, his voice shaking. Caleb examined the remains, nudging the severed head with the tip of his boot. "Looks like it. But it's not just one. There are more of them." As if on cue, more moans rose from the edges of the clearing. Figures staggered out of the shadows, their movements jerky and unnatural. Some were freshly turned, their skin still human-like, but marred by bloody wounds. Others were further along, their flesh rotted and gray. "We can't fight them all," Caleb said, readying his bow. "Not here." Smith nodded. "Fall back. Head for the ridge. We'll make our stand there." The ridge provided a narrow choke point, a natural bottleneck where the trees thinned out and the ground rose steeply. Smith positioned himself at the front, Caleb covering his flank with arrows. Graves stood farther back, his musket aimed at the approaching horde. The creatures emerged from the trees, their moans growing louder. Caleb loosed an arrow, striking one in the chest. It barely slowed. He adjusted his aim, shooting another through the eye. That one dropped instantly. "Go for the head," he shouted. Graves fired, the musket shot echoing through the forest. A creature collapsed, its skull shattered. "Reloading," he called, fumbling with powder and shot. Smith held his ground as the first of the creatures reached him. His sword flashed in the fading light, cutting through flesh and bone. Blood sprayed, the coppery smell thick in the air. But for every creature he cut down, 2 more took its place. "They just keep coming," Graves yelled. "We need to thin them out," Smith said, slashing through another attacker. "Caleb, how many arrows do you have?" "Not enough," Caleb replied, loosing another shot. "We can't stay here." Smith's mind raced. The ridge had seemed like a good idea, but now it felt like a death trap. They needed a way to break the horde's momentum. "Fire," he said suddenly. "We'll use fire." Graves looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "And burn the whole damn forest down." "It's that or die here," Smith snapped. "Caleb, grab anything flammable." "Graves, help me hold them off." Within moments, Caleb had gathered a pile of dry branches and grass. Using flint and steel, he sparked a flame, fanning it until the pile caught fire. The smoke rose quickly, thick and acrid, obscuring the advancing creatures. "Push it toward them," Smith ordered. Caleb used a fallen branch to shove the burning pile forward. The flames spread, licking at the underbrush. The creatures hesitated, their moans turning to guttural snarls as the fire blocked their path. "It's working," Graves said, reloading his musket. "For now," Smith said grimly. "But it won't stop them for long. We need to move." The 3 men retreated up the ridge, the fire buying them precious time. Behind them, the creatures milled about, some wandering into the flames and collapsing in heaps of charred flesh. But others found ways around the blaze, their relentless pursuit undeterred. As they reached the top of the ridge, Smith turned to Caleb. "How far are we from the village?" "Half a mile, maybe less," Caleb said. "We can make it, if we run." "Then let's go," Smith said. "And pray the village is ready for what's coming." They ran through the forest, the moans of the creatures fading behind them. But Smith knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The sickness was spreading, and the village was far from safe. As the gates of Roanoke came into view, Smith felt a pang of relief. But it was short-lived. The guard at the gate, a young man named Thomas, looked pale and shaken. "Captain," Thomas called as they approached. "You need to see this." Smith exchanged a glance with Caleb and Graves, then followed Thomas into the village. The scene that greeted him was chaos. Villagers were gathered in small, fearful clusters, whispering and pointing toward the center of the settlement. There, tied to a post, was a man. His skin was pale, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He strained against the ropes that bound him, snapping his teeth at anyone who came too close. "It's Edward," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "He came back from the woods like this. We don't know what to do." Smith's stomach turned. "How long has he been like this?" "An hour, maybe 2, Thomas said. "He hasn't stopped trying to bite people." Caleb stepped forward, his expression grim. "You know what needs to be done." Smith nodded, though the weight of the decision was heavy. "Get everyone back. This is going to get worse before it gets better." As he raised his sword, preparing to do what had to be done, Smith felt the eyes of the entire village on him. This was only the beginning. Chapter 9. The forest was no longer silent. The groans and shuffling steps of the undead filled the air like a macabre chorus, rising and falling as the creatures stumbled toward Roanoke. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows through the trees. Captain John Smith stood at the village gate, flanked by Caleb and Graves. The villagers behind them worked frantically, gathering timber and hammering crude spikes into makeshift barricades. Fear clung to them all like a second skin, but Smith kept his voice steady as he issued orders. "Reinforce the eastern wall," he barked, pointing toward the weakest section of the palisade. "Use every plank and scrap you can find. If it's not nailed down, it's part of the defense now." Caleb turned to him, his voice low. "We're running out of time. They'll be here before nightfall." Smith glanced at the horizon. The shadows of the trees stretched like grasping fingers toward the village. "Then we'll be ready." Graves muttered under his breath as he reloaded his musket. "Ready? Against them? There's no end to those things." Smith spun to face him. "We don't have the luxury of despair, Graves. These people are counting on us." A loud crash interrupted them. A group of villagers had overturned a cart full of supplies while trying to move it to the gate. Smith strode over, his temper fraying. "Pick it up. We don't have time for mistakes." One of the villagers, a wiry man named Walter, looked up, his face pale. "Captain, we're doing our best, but what if the barricades don't hold?" Smith met his gaze, softening his tone just enough. "Then we make sure the women and children get to safety. We fight as long as we can. But first, we hold this line." "Understood." Walter nodded, his hands trembling as he returned to work. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first of the creatures appeared. They emerged from the forest in small groups at first, their movements slow and halting. But soon more followed, their numbers swelling until the woods seemed alive with their grotesque forms. Caleb stood on the platform near the gate, his bow at the ready. He drew an arrow, aiming for the closest figure, a woman with tattered clothing and an unhinged jaw. The arrow struck true, burying itself in her skull. She crumpled to the ground, but the others pressed on. "They're testing us," Caleb muttered. Graves joined him, musket in hand. "Testing? They're mindless. Animals." "They're more than that," Caleb said, knocking another arrow. "Watch how they move. It's like they're searching for weakness." "Then they won't find one," Smith said, stepping up beside them. He surveyed the advancing horde, his face a mask of determination. "Hold your fire until they're closer. Make every shot count." The villagers lined the barricades, clutching whatever weapons they could find. Axes, pitchforks, and crude spears glinted in the fading light. The air was thick with tension, the kind that comes before a storm. When the first wave hit, it was like a flood breaking through a dam. The creatures surged forward, clawing and biting at the barricades. The villagers fought back with a desperation born of survival, stabbing and hacking at the grotesque forms. Smith's sword flashed as he cut down a creature trying to climb the wall. "Stay focused. Don't let them overwhelm you." Caleb fired arrow after arrow, each shot precise and deadly. "We can't keep this up all night." "Just keep them off the walls," Smith shouted back. Graves fired his musket, the shot echoing through the chaos. He cursed as he fumbled to reload. "Damn it, these things don't stop." "They stop when you hit the head," Caleb said, pulling a knife from his belt and throwing it into the skull of a creature climbing the barricade. Behind them, a scream cut through the air. Smith turned to see a section of the eastern wall buckle under the weight of the horde. "They're breaking through," a villager shouted. Smith didn't hesitate. "Caleb, with me. Graves, hold the gate." The two men sprinted toward the collapsing wall, their boots crunching on the blood-soaked ground. Villagers scrambled to reinforce the breach, but the creatures were pouring in faster than they could react. Smith threw himself into the fray, his sword a blur as he cut through the undead. Caleb followed, his tomahawk in hand, striking with brutal efficiency. "Push them back," Smith yelled, driving his blade into the chest of a snarling creature. Rebuild the wall. Walter and a handful of others worked frantically, hauling timber into place and hammering it down. The creatures clawed at them, their hands reaching through the gaps. Keep hammering, Caleb shouted, slamming his tomahawk into the head of an attacker. The battle raged on, the line between life and death growing thinner with each passing moment. Smith's arms ached from the weight of his sword, but he didn't falter. We can't hold them much longer, Caleb called out, his voice hoarse. Smith glanced around, his mind racing. Then he saw it, a wagon loaded with barrels of pitch, left abandoned near the center of the village. Caleb, the pitch, Smith pointed toward the wagon. Caleb's eyes widened. You're insane. Get it to the gate, Smith ordered. We'll set it alight and drive them back. Caleb didn't argue. He grabbed Walter and another villager, and together they pushed the wagon toward the gate. Graves, seeing the commotion, shouted down from his position. What the hell are you doing? Cover them, Smith called back. Graves muttered a curse but obeyed, firing his musket into the advancing horde. When the wagon reached the gate, Smith and Caleb worked quickly, smashing open the barrels and spreading the pitch along the barricades. The creatures pressed closer, their grotesque faces illuminated by the flickering torchlight. Light it, Smith shouted. Caleb hesitated for only a moment before dropping the torch. The pitch ignited with a roar, flames leaping into the air. The heat was intense, driving back the creatures in a wave of smoke and fire. The villagers cheered, their spirits momentarily lifted. But Smith knew better than to celebrate. This won't hold them for long, he said, his voice grim. We need a plan. Caleb nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. We've bought some time. Let's use it wisely. Smith turned to the villagers, his voice carrying over the crackling flames. Everyone, gather at the campfire. We need to talk about what comes next. As the flames burned brightly behind him, Smith felt the weight of the night pressing down. The creatures were relentless, and the fight was far from over. But for now, they had survived. And survival was all they could hope for. Chapter 10. The night stretched long, its silence broken only by the crackling of the dying fire at the gate. The makeshift barricade, scorched and splintered, loomed like a grim reminder of the relentless enemy just beyond. Captain John Smith paced the perimeter of the village, his eyes scanning every shadow, every movement in the tree line. They'll come again, Caleb muttered, sitting on the edge of a wagon, sharpening his tomahawk. His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed a faint tremor. They always do, Smith replied, not looking at him. Walter approached, his face drawn with exhaustion. We've reinforced the eastern wall as best we could, Captain, but we're running out of wood. And nails. And hope, if I'm honest. Smith stopped pacing and turned to face him. Hope doesn't build walls, Walter. Timber and grit do. Focus on the task at hand. Walter nodded, though his shoulders slumped as he walked away. Graves, perched atop the palisade, squinted into the darkness. I can feel 'em out there. Just waiting. Let them wait, Caleb said, standing and testing the weight of his tomahawk. We'll be ready. Smith's gaze lingered on the horizon. The flames from the earlier battle had scorched a wide swath of forest, but beyond that, the trees stood dense and unyielding. Somewhere in that expanse, the dead were regrouping, or whatever their mindless equivalent of regrouping was. By the time the first groans reached their ears, the moon hung high in the sky, bathing the village in pale light. The sound was faint at first, almost like the rustling of leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct, the guttural, inhuman noises of the undead. They're coming, Graves called down, his voice sharp. Smith rallied the villagers, who scrambled to their positions. The women and children huddled in the center of the village, their faces pale with fear. Caleb joined Smith at the gate, his expression grim. Looks like they've brought friends this time. Smith peered into the shadows beyond the fire's dying embers. The first figures emerged from the tree line, their shuffling movements unnerving in their unpredictability. Behind them, more followed, dozens, maybe hundreds. "Everyone hold your positions," Smith commanded. "We fight smarter this time." Walter, gripping a makeshift spear, swallowed hard. "How do you fight smarter against things that don't stop?" "You aim for the head," Caleb said, his voice cold. Graves fired the first shot, the musket's report echoing through the village. The lead zombie fell, its head snapping back as the bullet found its mark. "That's one," Graves muttered, reloading. The battle that followed was chaos. The undead threw themselves at the barricades, their bodies piling up as the villagers fought back with spears, axes, and the few firearms they had left. Smith moved through the fray like a man possessed, his sword cutting a path through the attackers. He shouted orders, his voice rising above the din. "Don't let them breach the walls. Push them back." Caleb fought beside him, his tomahawk flashing in the moonlight. He grabbed a fallen spear and thrust it through the chest of an oncoming zombie, then yanked it free and swung at another. "Captain!" Graves shouted from his perch. "The eastern wall." Smith turned to see a group of zombies clawing at the weakened section of the barricade. The wood creaked ominously, and a section began to buckle. "Caleb, with me," Smith called, rushing toward the breach. By the time they reached the eastern wall, several zombies had already broken through. Villagers fought desperately to hold the line, but the creatures were relentless. Smith charged into the fray, his sword flashing. He decapitated one zombie, then pivoted to drive the blade into the skull of another. Caleb was right behind him, his tomahawk and knife moving with brutal efficiency. "We need more wood here," Smith shouted. Walter and a few others rushed forward, dragging planks and tools. They worked as quickly as they could, hammering the barricade back into place while Smith and Caleb fought to hold the gap. "Faster," Caleb urged, slamming his tomahawk into a zombie's temple. The barricade held, but barely. Walter collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. "That's all we've got, Captain." Smith pulled him to his feet. "It'll have to do. Get back to the main gate." As the night wore on, the tide of zombies showed no sign of abating. The villagers were exhausted, their movements slowing. Graves fired his musket again, then cursed as he realized he was out of ammunition. "Damn it. I'm dry." "Then grab a spear," Smith said, tossing him one. "This isn't over." Graves caught the weapon and grimaced. "I signed up to fight Indians, not whatever the hell these things are." "They're what we've got," Caleb said, his tone curt. A loud crash drew their attention. The main gate shuddered under the weight of the attackers, the wood splintering. "They're going to break through," a villager shouted. Smith's mind raced. They couldn't hold much longer. But they couldn't retreat, not yet. "Light the pitch," he ordered. Walter hesitated. "But Captain, we don't have enough left to." "Light it," Smith bellowed. Walter obeyed, throwing a torch into the remaining barrels of pitch. Flames roared to life, illuminating the gate and the horde beyond. The heat was intense, forcing the villagers to back away. The fire drove the zombies back, but only for a moment. The creatures at the front burned, their flesh blistering and blackening, but those behind them pressed forward, undeterred by the flames. "We need another plan," Caleb said, his voice tight. Smith nodded, his jaw clenched. "Gather everyone at the campfire. It's time to decide our next move." The villagers huddled around the fire, their faces drawn and weary. The flames cast flickering shadows across their tired expressions. Smith stood before them, his sword resting against his hip. "We've done all we can here. The walls won't hold much longer." "What are you saying?" Walter asked, his voice trembling. "I'm saying we need to leave," Smith said. "We can't defend this village forever. We need to find safety elsewhere." Where? Graves demanded. The forest is crawling with those things. There's nowhere to go. There's the sea, Caleb said. If we can make it to the coast, we can build rafts. Get to an island, maybe. An island? Walter repeated. That's your plan? Do you have a better one? Caleb shot back. Smith raised a hand to silence them. Enough. This isn't up for debate. At dawn, we'll gather what supplies we can carry and head for the coast. It's our best chance. The villagers murmured among themselves, their fear palpable. But no one voiced an objection. As the fire crackled and the groans of the undead echoed in the distance, Smith stared into the flames. The road ahead would be perilous, but it was the only way to survive. For now, they had a plan. And in the face of such relentless horror, that was enough. Chapter 11. The first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the battered village. Smoke hung in the air from the fires of the night before, mingling with the acrid stench of death. The villagers moved silently, their movements deliberate and quick as they gathered what few supplies they could carry. Captain John Smith stood near the remains of the main gate, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The relentless horde had withdrawn into the forest during the darkest hours of the night, but he knew they would return. They always did. "We'll travel light," Smith said, addressing the small group gathered around him. "Weapons, food, water. No luxuries. Every extra pound will slow us down, and speed is our only ally now." Walter adjusted the strap of his satchel, his face pale and drawn. "What if they're already out there, Captain? Waiting for us in the woods?" "They are," Caleb said flatly, securing his tomahawk to his belt. "But we've got no choice. You want to sit here and wait for them to break through." Walter didn't answer, but the look on his face said enough. As the sun rose higher, Smith led the group to the edge of the village. The woods loomed dark and foreboding, their depths seemingly endless. The villagers huddled close, the fear in their eyes unspoken but palpable. Graves adjusted the grip on his spear. "Remind me again why we're heading for the sea. Seems like a long shot, doesn't it?" "An island is defensible," Smith replied without turning around. "No trees for them to hide behind. One point of entry. If we make it, we can regroup, maybe even rebuild. And if we don't make it," Graves muttered. "Then you won't have to worry about long shots," Caleb said, his tone clipped. Smith raised a hand to silence them. "Enough. We move out now. Stay close, stay quiet, and don't stop unless I say so." The forest was eerily silent as they moved through it, the crunch of leaves underfoot sounding unnaturally loud. Smith took the lead, his sword drawn, while Caleb brought up the rear with his tomahawk at the ready. The rest of the group, mostly untrained villagers armed with spears and makeshift weapons, stayed in the middle, their eyes darting nervously to every shadow. They hadn't gone far when the first sound reached them, a low guttural groan, faint but unmistakable. "Hold," Smith whispered, raising his hand. The group froze, their breaths held as they strained to locate the source of the noise. "There?" Caleb murmured, pointing toward a dense thicket. The underbrush rustled, and a figure emerged. It was a woman, or at least what had once been a woman. Her skin was gray and mottled, her eyes clouded and lifeless. She stumbled toward them, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Let me," Graves said, stepping forward. He thrust his spear at the creature, the point driving through her chest. She didn't stop. Her hands clawed at the air, her mouth opening in a ghastly moan. "Head," Smith barked. "Go for the head." Graves yanked the spear free and thrust again, this time aiming for the skull. The weapon pierced her temple, and she collapsed to the ground in a heap. "Lesson learned," Graves muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. The encounter left the group rattled, but they pressed on. As the hours passed, the forest seemed to close in around them, the air growing thicker and the shadows darker. Smith halted the group near a small stream, gesturing for them to refill their water skins. "We'll rest here for a moment," he said. Caleb crouched beside the water, scanning the area. "Too quiet," he muttered. "What do you mean?" Walter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, there should be birds. Bugs. Something. This place is dead." Before Walter could respond, a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence. The group scrambled to their feet, weapons drawn. The scream had come from up ahead, and it was followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, fast, heavy, and getting closer. "Form up," Smith ordered. The villagers moved together, their weapons raised. The first zombie burst through the trees, its jaws snapping as it lunged at them. Smith swung his sword, decapitating the creature in one fluid motion. More followed, 5, 10, a dozen, all crashing through the underbrush with mindless ferocity. "Keep moving," Smith shouted. "Don't let them surround us." Caleb fought like a man possessed, his tomahawk and knife a blur of motion. He drove his blade into one zombie's skull, then spun to slash at another. Graves and Walter worked together, their spears thrusting in unison to hold the creatures at bay. But for every zombie they killed, more seemed to take its place. "We're not going to make it," Walter cried. "Yes, we will," Smith yelled back. "Keep fighting." The group fell back toward a narrow ravine, the steep walls offering some protection from the horde. Smith positioned himself at the entrance, his sword cutting down any zombie that tried to enter. "We can't stay here," Caleb said, his breathing ragged. "They'll just keep coming." Smith scanned the ravine, his mind racing. His eyes landed on a cluster of boulders further up. "There. We can use those to block the entrance." Graves and Caleb moved quickly, heaving the rocks into place as the others fought to hold the line. The barricade wasn't perfect, but it was enough to slow the zombies down. For now. As night fell, the group huddled together in the ravine, the sounds of the undead echoing in the distance. "We can't keep doing this," Walter said, his voice trembling. "They're everywhere. There's no way out." "There's always a way out," Smith said firmly. "We just have to find it." Caleb leaned against the rocks, his tomahawk resting on his lap. "The sea better be worth it, Captain." "It will be," Smith replied. But even as he spoke, he couldn't ignore the doubt creeping into his mind. For the first time, he wondered if their fight was truly hopeless, or if survival was just a cruel illusion. The night stretched on, the group taking turns keeping watch. Smith sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He could hear the zombies in the distance, their groans a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded them. "Captain," Caleb said, sitting down beside him, "you really think we can make it to the coast?" "We have to," Smith said. "There's no other choice." Caleb nodded, though his expression remained grim. "Then we'd better get moving at first light. They won't wait for us to rest." Smith nodded, his jaw set. He knew Caleb was right. The road ahead would be long and perilous, but they had no other option. For now, all they could do was survive the night, and hope that tomorrow would bring them one step closer to safety. Chapter 12. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows against the rocky walls of the ravine. Exhaustion hung heavy in the air, but sleep had eluded most of the group. Every groan from the forest and scrape of claw against stone reminded them of the growing horde. Captain John Smith crouched near the barricade at the ravine's mouth, his sword resting across his knees. He glanced over his shoulder at the huddled villagers. Most were silent, their faces pale in the dim firelight. Caleb leaned against the rocks, sharpening his tomahawk with deliberate strokes, while Graves checked the bindings on his spear. "We can't stay here much longer," Smith muttered. "No kidding," Caleb replied, his eyes fixed on the blade in his hand. "But moving without a plan is a death sentence." Smith nodded, his mind working furiously. The narrow ravine had saved them from being overwhelmed, but it was a trap of its own. The zombies would keep coming, their numbers swelling with every hour they delayed. At dawn, Smith gathered the group around the dying fire. "Listen up," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're making our move today. Sitting here only gives them more time to surround us." Walter looked up, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "But where do we go?" "They're everywhere." "To the sea," Smith said. "That's always been the goal. An island is our best chance." "How do we get through them?" Graves asked, gesturing toward the barricade. "They're packed in tight out there." Smith unfolded a rough map he'd sketched on a scrap of bark. "We'll split into 2 groups. A smaller party will create a diversion, drawing the zombies away from the ravine. The rest will slip out and head west toward the river." "That's madness," Walter said. "You're asking us to walk into a horde." "I'm not asking," Smith said, his tone sharp. "I'm telling you, this is our only option. If we wait here, we all die." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one argued further. Caleb stood, sliding his tomahawk into his belt. "I'll go with the distraction party," he said. "Might as well put this to good use." He patted the bow slung across his back. Smith nodded. "Good. Graves, you're with me. We'll lead the diversion. Walter, you stay with the main group and keep them moving." Walter's face twisted in protest, but he said nothing. An hour later, the plan was in motion. Smith and his small team crouched in the underbrush at the edge of the ravine, the horde of zombies just beyond their makeshift barricade. "Ready," Smith whispered. Graves nodded, his knuckles white around the shaft of his spear. Caleb notched an arrow, his eyes scanning the crowd of shambling figures. Smith hefted a torch, its flames sputtering in the cool morning air. "On my signal." He hurled the torch into the horde. It landed among the zombies, setting a cluster of dry leaves ablaze. The creatures turned toward the fire, their moans growing louder. "Now," Smith shouted. Caleb loosed his arrow, the shaft burying itself in the skull of a zombie near the front. Graves followed with a thrust of his spear, skewering another through the eye. The group charged forward, weapons swinging, as they hacked their way through the undead. The zombies, slow to react, stumbled toward the noise and movement. "Keep moving," Smith yelled. "Don't let them surround you." The diversion worked. The zombies turned their attention to the commotion, giving the main group a chance to slip out of the ravine unnoticed. Walter led the villagers west, his heart pounding as he glanced over his shoulder. The sounds of battle faded as they moved deeper into the forest, but the fear didn't leave him. "Keep going," he urged, his voice trembling. "Don't stop." Back at the ravine, Smith's group was fighting tooth and nail to stay alive. Caleb fired arrow after arrow, each shot finding its mark. Graves swung his spear in wide arcs, keeping the zombies at bay. Smith's sword was slick with blackened blood, his arm aching from the effort. He sidestepped a lunging zombie, bringing his blade down in a powerful arc that split its skull. "Fall back," he shouted, his voice hoarse. The 3 men retreated into the trees, the horde shuffling after them. They moved quickly, weaving between trunks and ducking under low-hanging branches. "How far do we take this?" Graves panted, glancing over his shoulder. "Far enough," Smith said. "We need to give the others a real head start." The forest thinned as they reached the edge of a rocky clearing. Smith skidded to a halt, his eyes scanning the terrain. "This way," he said, leading them toward a narrow path that wound between 2 jagged cliffs. The zombies followed, their groans echoing off the stone walls. "This is a dead end?" Caleb said, his tone grim. "Not for us," Smith replied, pointing to a narrow ledge halfway up the cliff face. "Climb. Now." Graves didn't hesitate, scrambling up the rock face with surprising speed. Caleb followed, his bow slung over one shoulder. Smith brought up the rear, his fingers slipping on the rough stone as he hauled himself upward. From their perch on the ledge, the men watched as the horde stumbled into the clearing below. The zombies milled about aimlessly, their prey suddenly out of reach. "Smart move," Caleb said, catching his breath. Smith nodded, though his expression remained grim. "We're not out of this yet. They'll spread out again soon, and we need to be far away when they do." Graves peered down at the horde. "And the others? You think they made it?" "They'll make it," Smith said firmly. "We just have to keep our end of the bargain." The three men rested for a moment, their bodies weary but their resolve unbroken. Smith pulled a scrap of cloth from his pocket, using it to clean his blade. "We'll head west," he said. "Circle back to meet up with the others at the river." Caleb nodded, slinging his bow across his back. "Let's hope they're still there." "They will be," Smith said, though the weight of doubt pressed heavily on his chest. For now, all they could do was keep moving, and pray that their gamble had bought the villagers enough time to survive. Chapter 13. The walls of the Roanoke fort loomed high, sharp-tipped logs forming a barrier against the horrors in the woods. Inside, tension simmered as the survivors of the escape huddled together in clusters, their faces pale and lined with fear. The fire in the center of the square burned low, its weak glow casting long shadows that danced across anxious expressions. Captain Smith stood at the edge of the gathering, his jaw set as he scanned the villagers. His clothes were torn and dirt-streaked from days of fighting and fleeing, but his eyes burned with determination. "Gather round," Smith called. His voice was strong, cutting through the low murmur of frightened conversations. "We need to talk about our supplies." Walter, standing near the fire, stepped forward. "What's there to talk about? We've got next to nothing left. Everyone knows that." Smith ignored the bitterness in Walter's tone. "We've got enough to last a few days, if we're careful. But we'll need to ration, strictly. No one takes more than their share." "That's easy for you to say," snapped Eleanor, a gaunt woman clutching her two young sons to her sides. "You're strong. You can survive on scraps. My boys can't." "None of us can afford to think like that," Smith replied sharply. "If we don't stick to a plan, we'll all starve before the zombies even reach us." Tension thickened as the villagers began to argue. Some sided with Smith, understanding the need for discipline, while others, driven by desperation, called for immediate solutions. "What about hunting?" asked Caleb, stepping into the circle. His bow was slung across his back, the string frayed from constant use. "We've got a few good hunters here. Let us go out and bring back meat." Smith shook his head. "We've already seen what's out there. Every trip into the woods is a risk, and the horde is growing. We can't afford to lose more people." Caleb's lips tightened, but he said nothing. Graves, sitting on an overturned barrel near the gate, leaned forward. "There's another option," he said, his voice calm but heavy. "The cache." The murmurs stopped. All eyes turned to Graves. "What cache?" Eleanor asked suspiciously. Graves looked to Smith, who sighed. "Before the trouble started, we buried a supply cache outside the fort. Food, tools, some weapons. It was meant as a backup in case of an Indian attack." "Why haven't you gotten it already?" Walter demanded. "Because it's in the woods," Smith said. "And the woods are crawling with those things." A heated debate erupted. Some argued that retrieving the cache was their only hope, while others insisted it was too dangerous. "We'll die here without that food," Caleb said, his voice rising above the din. "I'll go. I'm not afraid." "You should be," Graves said grimly. "Bravery won't keep you alive out there." Smith raised a hand, silencing the group. "We'll send a team," he said. "Volunteers only. But understand this. It's a suicide mission if you're not careful. Stick to the plan, and don't take unnecessary risks." "I'll go," Caleb said immediately. "So will I," added Graves, standing. Smith nodded, his respect for the men evident in his expression. "Good. We'll need one more." A moment of silence passed before Sarah, the young healer, stepped forward. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "I'll go." "No," Smith said firmly. "We need you here." "You need someone who knows the layout of the land," Sarah countered. "I helped bury the cache. I know exactly where it is." Smith hesitated, then relented. "Fine. But you stay in the back. Caleb and Graves will handle any trouble." An hour later, the 3 volunteers stood at the gate, armed and ready. Caleb had his bow, a quiver of arrows strapped to his back. Graves carried his spear, its tip newly sharpened. Sarah held a small blade, though her grip was unsure. Smith stood before them, his expression stern. "Stick together. No heroics. Get the cache and get back. Nothing else matters." Caleb grinned, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "We'll be back before you know it." Smith didn't smile. "I'll hold you to that." The forest was eerily quiet as the trio slipped through the trees. The faint rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig were the only sounds. Caleb led the way, his bow at the ready, with Graves close behind and Sarah bringing up the rear. "Are you sure this is the right direction?" Graves asked after a while. Sarah nodded. "Positive. It's not far now." Caleb paused, raising a hand for silence. He crouched low, scanning the shadows ahead. After a tense moment, he straightened. "Clear," he whispered. The group pressed on, their movements careful and deliberate. They reached the clearing, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the earth. At the center of the clearing, partially hidden beneath a pile of rocks, was the cache. "There," Sarah said, pointing. Caleb nodded, moving toward the rocks. Graves stayed close, his spear at the ready. As they began to dig, Sarah kept watch, her blade clutched tightly in her hand. The forest around them felt alive, every shadow shifting, every sound magnified. "Hurry up," she urged, her voice trembling. "We're working on it," Caleb grunted, tossing a rock aside. The cache was uncovered, a wooden crate filled with sacks of grain, dried meat, and a few iron tools. Caleb and Graves began loading the supplies into their packs. "We've got it," Caleb said, standing. "Let's move." As they turned to leave, a low moan echoed through the trees. "Run," Graves hissed. The trio sprinted back toward the fort, the supplies weighing heavily on their backs. Behind them, the moans grew louder, joined by the snapping of branches and the shuffle of feet. "They're gaining," Sarah gasped, her breath coming in short bursts. "Keep moving," Caleb shouted. Graves stopped suddenly, turning to face the oncoming horde. "Go," he yelled. "I'll hold them off." "No," Sarah cried, but Caleb grabbed her arm, dragging her forward. "We can't stop," he said, his voice raw. "He knows what he's doing." The last thing they saw of Graves was his silhouette, standing tall against the oncoming tide of the undead. When Caleb and Sarah burst through the gates of the fort, breathless and bloodied, the villagers rushed to meet them. "Where's Graves?" Smith demanded. Caleb shook his head, his expression grim. "He stayed behind. To buy us time." Smith's face darkened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned to the villagers. "We've got the supplies," he said. "But it cost us. Let's make sure it wasn't for nothing." The villagers cheered weakly, their voices tinged with sorrow. As the fort settled into an uneasy quiet, Smith stood at the gate, staring into the darkness. Somewhere out there, Graves was fighting for his life, or had already lost it. Smith clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. The cost of survival was growing steeper by the day, and the end was nowhere in sight. Chapter 14. The campfire flickered, casting long, jagged shadows on the faces gathered around it. The group huddled close, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and hope. The thin stockade walls of the fort provided little comfort, but the fire's warmth made the biting night air a bit more bearable. Captain John Smith sat at the head of the circle, his back straight despite the weariness in his eyes. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a shower of sparks. Around him, villagers murmured quietly, their voices barely audible over the crackling flames. "Listen," Smith said, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. The murmurs ceased, all eyes turning to him. "We can't stay here much longer." Walter, seated on an overturned bucket, crossed his arms. "We've heard this before, Captain. What's different now?" "The difference," Smith said evenly, "is that the zombies are learning. They follow our patrols. They avoid obvious traps. And they're getting bolder every night." A shudder passed through the group. No one could deny it. The attacks on the fort had grown more frequent, more coordinated. "So what's your plan, Captain?" asked Sarah, her voice steady despite the tension in her posture. Smith leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "We're going to leave. All of us." A ripple of surprise swept through the group. Eleanor, clutching her young son close, looked at Smith with wide eyes. "Leave? And go where?" "East," Smith said. "To the sea. There's a ship waiting for us there, a merchant vessel. If we can reach it, we'll be safe." "Safe from what?" Walter snapped. "Those things can't swim, but they sure as hell can wait." "And what about food? Supplies?" "Everything's already accounted for," Smith said, his tone calm but firm. "We'll bring what we can carry. The ship has stores. It's a risk, but staying here is a death sentence." The group erupted into debate. Some, like Sarah and Caleb, sided with Smith, eager to escape the doomed fort. Others, like Walter, argued against abandoning their home. "This is all we've got," Walter said, slamming his fist against the ground. "We can defend it. We've done it before." "Not for much longer," Sarah countered. "You've seen them, Walter. They're learning. They're not just mindless anymore." "Enough," Smith barked, silencing the argument. "I'm not asking for consensus. This is happening. If you want to stay, that's your choice. But don't expect us to come back for you." The threat hung heavy in the air. No one spoke for a long moment. "We'll need a distraction," Caleb said finally. "Something to draw them away while we move." Smith nodded. "That's where the scouts come in. We'll split into two groups. One group will create a diversion. Noise, fire, whatever it takes to pull the horde away. The rest will head for the coast." "I'll lead the distraction," Caleb volunteered, his voice resolute. "No," Smith said. "I will." Caleb frowned. "With respect, Captain, you're the best chance we have of making it to the ship. If you fall, the rest of us are finished." Smith hesitated, then nodded grudgingly. "Fine. You'll lead the distraction. But you'll need backup." "I'll go," Sarah said immediately. "And me," Graves added, his face set in determination. Smith scanned the group, his gaze lingering on each face. "The rest of you, pack what you can carry. We leave at dawn." The next morning, the fort buzzed with quiet activity. Villagers loaded sacks of food and supplies onto makeshift sledges, their movements swift and purposeful. Smith stood at the gate, checking his pistol and sword. Caleb approached, his bow slung across his back and a bundle of arrows in hand. "We'll head north," Caleb said. "There's a ravine about a mile out. If we can get the horde into it, we might buy you enough time to reach the coast." "Make it back alive," Smith said. It wasn't a request. Caleb grinned, though the tension in his eyes betrayed him. "I'll do my best." By mid-morning, the groups were ready. Caleb, Sarah, and Graves stood at the edge of the forest, their faces set with grim determination. "Let's give them something to chase," Caleb said, notching an arrow to his bow. The three disappeared into the trees, their footsteps fading quickly. Moments later, the sound of shouts and the sharp twang of arrows echoed through the woods. Smith motioned to the rest of the villagers. "Move out." The journey through the forest was harrowing. Every step was a gamble, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. Smith led the group, his sword drawn, his eyes scanning constantly. Behind him, the villagers moved in a loose line, their faces pale with fear. Eleanor struggled to keep her son quiet, her hand clamped firmly over his mouth. "Keep going," Smith urged, his voice low but firm. "We're almost there." In the distance, the sounds of the distraction team faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Smith's grip tightened on his sword. "Captain," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Smith turned to see her pointing ahead. At first, he saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then, slowly, shapes began to emerge. They weren't human. The horde was massive, far larger than any they had faced before. Dozens of shambling figures moved through the trees, their eyes empty but their movements purposeful. "They must have split off from the main group," Smith muttered. "They're hunting us." "What do we do?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Smith didn't hesitate. "We fight." The villagers formed a loose circle, their weapons raised. Smith stood at the front, his sword gleaming in the dappled sunlight. "Hold the line," he shouted as the first wave of zombies descended. The battle was chaotic, brutal. Villagers fought with everything they had, axes, knives, even farming tools. Smith moved like a force of nature, cutting down zombies with precise, deadly strikes. By the time the horde was defeated, the group was battered but alive. Smith wiped blood from his face, his chest heaving with exertion. "Everyone okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. A few murmurs of assent came in reply. "Then let's keep moving," he said. "We're not out of the woods yet." Hours later, the forest began to thin. The smell of salt filled the air, and the distant sound of waves reached their ears. "There it is," Sarah said, her voice filled with relief. Through the trees they saw the coast, a stretch of rocky shore with a small ship anchored just offshore. "We made it," Eleanor whispered, clutching her son tightly. But Smith's expression remained grim. "We're not safe yet. Get to the beach. Now." As the group hurried toward the shore, Smith turned back, his gaze fixed on the forest. Somewhere behind them, Caleb, Sarah, and Graves were still fighting. "Don't make me come looking for you," he muttered, before following the others to safety. Chapter 15. The ship swayed gently in the shallow waters, its weathered sails catching the faint breeze that swept across the coastline. Villagers clustered along the beach, their faces pale and drawn with exhaustion. Some knelt in the sand, muttering prayers, while others simply stared out at the horizon, their expressions blank with fatigue. John Smith stood apart from the others, his gaze fixed on the dark line of the forest. The trees stood silent, but he knew better than to trust the stillness. "They should have been back by now," he said, his voice low. Eleanor approached, her son clinging to her skirts. "Do you think they made it?" Smith didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened as he scanned the tree line. "They'll make it," he said finally, though his tone carried more resolve than certainty. The villagers had begun to move toward the longboat tied to the shore when a distant shout broke the quiet. Heads snapped around, eyes searching the tree line. "Over there!" Sarah's voice rang out, and moments later Caleb and Graves stumbled into view. They were battered, bloodied, and out of breath, but alive. A wave of relief swept through the crowd. Smith strode toward them, his sword still drawn. "Where's Sarah?" he asked, his voice sharp. Graves shook his head, leaning heavily on Caleb. "She stayed behind. To buy us time." Smith's jaw clenched. "Damn it. How far back?" "Not far," Caleb said. "She told us to keep moving. Said she'd meet us at the shore." Smith turned toward the trees, his grip tightening on his sword. "You're not going in there, are you?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "She's out there," Smith said. "I'm not leaving her behind." The forest was a cacophony of sound, groaning branches, the rustle of leaves, and the distant growls of the undead. Smith moved swiftly, his steps deliberate and silent. Every nerve in his body was on edge, his senses heightened. He found Sarah near a small clearing, her back against a tree. She was fighting off 3 zombies with nothing but a dagger and a broken spear. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but her movements were precise and controlled. "Hold on!" Smith shouted, charging into the fray. The first zombie turned at the sound of Smith's voice, its rotted face twisting in a grotesque snarl. Smith swung his sword, the blade cleaving through decayed flesh and bone. "About time," Sarah said, driving her dagger into the neck of another zombie. "Didn't plan on missing the party," Smith replied, stepping between her and the remaining undead. The final zombie lunged, its clawed hands reaching for Smith. He sidestepped and brought his sword down in a powerful arc, severing its head from its shoulders. Sarah sagged against the tree, her chest heaving. "I told them to go," she said, her voice hoarse. "Didn't want anyone else getting hurt." Smith offered her his hand. "You did what you thought was right. Now let's get out of here." She took his hand, and together they began the trek back to the shore. When they emerged from the forest, the sight of them brought a cheer from the villagers. Eleanor ran forward, tears streaming down her face. "You made it," she cried, pulling Sarah into a tight embrace. "We're not done yet," Smith said, his gaze shifting to the ship. The villagers began boarding the longboat, their movements hurried but organized. Smith and Sarah stood at the water's edge, their weapons still drawn. "Do you think they'll follow us into the water?" Sarah asked. Smith shook his head. "Not if we're lucky." As if in response, a low growl rumbled from the forest. Dozens of figures emerged from the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Move!" Smith shouted, ushering Sarah toward the boat. The longboat rocked as the last of the villagers climbed aboard. Smith and Sarah pushed it into the water, wading out until the waves reached their knees. "Get everyone to the ship," Smith yelled to Caleb, who was manning the oars. "What about you?" Caleb shouted back. "We'll be right behind you," Smith replied. The zombies reached the shore, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. But their sheer numbers were overwhelming. Smith and Sarah fought side by side, their blades cutting through the horde. For every zombie they felled, 2 more seemed to take its place. "We can't hold them off much longer," Sarah shouted, her voice strained. Smith glanced over his shoulder. The longboat was nearly at the ship. "Time to go," he said. They backed toward the water, their movements slow and deliberate. The waves lapped at their ankles as the first zombies waded into the surf. "Now," Smith shouted. They turned and sprinted toward the ship. The zombies followed, their growls rising in a deafening crescendo. By the time they reached the longboat, the villagers had thrown down a rope ladder. Smith and Sarah climbed quickly, their hands slipping on the wet ropes. As they reached the deck, the first zombies began to claw at the hull. "Cut the lines," Smith ordered. Caleb and Graves worked quickly, severing the ropes that tethered the ship to the shore. The sails caught the wind, and the vessel began to move. The zombies thrashed in the water, their movements growing sluggish as the waves pulled them under. Smith stood at the rail, his sword still in hand. He watched the shore grow smaller, his expression unreadable. "We made it," Sarah said, her voice soft. "For now," Smith replied. The ship sailed on, the coastline fading into the distance. The villagers huddled together, their faces a mix of relief and exhaustion. Smith leaned against the rail, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "What now?" Sarah asked, stepping beside him. Smith's grip tightened on the hilt of his sword. "Now we figure out how to survive." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the ship sailed into the unknown, carrying its fragile cargo of hope and the weight of what they had left behind. Chapter 16. The forest was alive with the unnerving sounds of the undead, low growls, the shuffle of feet through leaves, and the occasional heart-stopping snap of a branch. Smith crouched low beside the scout, his hand gripping his sword hilt. Around them, the distraction party was spread thin, each member fighting to stay silent despite the overwhelming sense of dread. "We'll keep them here long enough for the others to reach the coastline," Smith whispered, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise. The scout, an expert in moving unseen through hostile terrain, nodded. "They're closer than they were 10 minutes ago," he said, scanning the underbrush. "We have to move." Behind them, Graves clutched a makeshift spear and adjusted his position against a tree trunk. "This better work," he muttered to Caleb, who was gripping his musket tightly. "It will," Caleb replied, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his nerves. A guttural moan echoed through the trees, and both men froze. The sound was closer now, too close. "Hold steady," Smith hissed, his voice cutting through the tension like steel. The first of the zombies appeared through the undergrowth, its decayed form lurching into the open. More followed, their rotting faces illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. "Now," Smith ordered. Graves hurled his spear, the point driving through the skull of the nearest zombie. Caleb's musket fired with a deafening crack, the shot tearing through another. The distraction party erupted into action, drawing the undead toward them with shouts and flashing blades. "Keep them moving. Draw them away from the others," Smith yelled, slashing at a zombie that lunged toward him. The scout fired an arrow, the shaft sinking into the eye socket of a snarling corpse. "There's too many," he said, knocking another arrow. "We can't hold this position for long." "We don't need long," Smith replied, cutting down another attacker. "Just enough time." The zombies pressed forward, their numbers seemingly endless. Caleb and Graves fought back to back, their movements growing more frantic with each passing moment. "Smith!" Graves shouted, his spear snapping in half as he drove it into the chest of a zombie. "We're getting overrun here." "Fall back," Smith called, retreating toward a narrow ravine. "Draw them in and bottleneck them." The distraction party scrambled toward the ravine, their weapons swinging wildly as they tried to keep the undead at bay. Smith and the scout took up positions at the mouth of the ravine, their blades cutting down any zombie that ventured too close. "This is suicide," Caleb said, reloading his musket with trembling hands. "Not if we hold the line," Smith replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. The narrow passage worked to their advantage, forcing the zombies into a bottleneck. But even with the reduced numbers, the sheer force of the horde was overwhelming. Graves, now armed with a hatchet, swung wildly at an approaching zombie. "We can't keep this up," he shouted. "We don't have to," Smith replied, driving his sword through the skull of another attacker. "Just a little longer." The plan was working. The undead were drawn away from the path the villagers had taken toward the coast. But the cost was steep. Caleb went down first, a zombie grabbing his arm and dragging him into the mass of decaying bodies. His scream was short-lived, swallowed by the sound of tearing flesh. "Caleb!" Graves roared, his face contorted with grief. "Stay focused," Smith barked, grabbing Graves by the arm and pulling him back. "He gave us a chance. Don't waste it." The scout loosed another arrow, his quiver nearly empty. "We're running out of time," he said, his voice grim. Smith nodded, his jaw set. "On my mark, we break for the coastline. Graves, cover our rear." Graves wiped blood from his face and gave a curt nod. "Understood." The group began their retreat, moving quickly but carefully through the dense forest. The zombies followed, their groans rising in a chilling crescendo. "Faster," Smith urged, his sword slashing through a branch blocking their path. The scout paused to fire one last arrow, the shot taking down a zombie that had strayed too close. "That's it," he said, tossing his empty quiver aside. The coastline came into view, the faint outline of the ship visible against the dark water. The sight spurred the group forward, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. But the zombies were relentless. Graves stumbled, his foot catching on a root. Before he could recover, a pair of undead hands grabbed him, dragging him to the ground. "Go." Graves shouted, swinging his hatchet at the approaching horde. "Get to the ship!" "Graves," Smith turned, his expression torn. "There's no time," the scout said, grabbing Smith by the arm. "He knows what he's doing." Smith hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "We'll remember him," he said, his voice heavy with regret. The group reached the shoreline, the waves lapping at their boots. The ship's crew had lowered a longboat, and Sarah stood at the bow, waving frantically. "Over here," she called. Smith and the scout waded into the water, helping the remaining members of the distraction party into the boat. The zombies were close now, their forms illuminated by the moonlight. "Push off," Smith ordered, his voice carrying over the sound of the waves. The crew heaved, the longboat lurching forward as it broke free from the shallows. The zombies reached the water's edge, their movements slowing as they waded into the surf. Some were pulled under by the current, their decayed bodies no match for the waves. Smith watched from the longboat, his sword still in hand. His face was grim, his thoughts clearly on those they had lost. "We made it," Sarah said, her voice soft. "For now," Smith replied, his gaze fixed on the ship ahead. As the longboat approached the ship, the crew threw down ropes to haul them aboard. The villagers gathered on deck, their faces a mix of relief and sorrow. Smith climbed the rope ladder, his movements slow with exhaustion. When he reached the deck, he turned to face the group. "We've bought ourselves some time," he said, his voice steady despite the weariness etched into his features. "But this isn't over." The ship's sails unfurled, catching the wind as it moved away from the shore. The coastline faded into the distance, the forest disappearing into the night. Smith stood at the rail, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Behind him, the villagers huddled together, their whispers carrying a mix of hope and fear. The scout joined him, his expression unreadable. "What's next?" he asked. Smith didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "We keep moving," he said finally. "And we don't look back." The ship sailed on, its passengers clinging to the fragile hope of safety, even as the shadows of their past loomed large on the horizon. Chapter 17. The sun was beginning to set, casting a burnt orange glow over the horizon. Captain Smith stood at the bow of the ship, the salty wind biting his face. Behind him, the villagers were quiet, too exhausted to talk after the grueling escape. The undead horde on the shoreline had disappeared from view, but their presence lingered like a shadow over everyone's thoughts. The scout approached, his steps quiet but deliberate. "We'll reach the inlet by nightfall," he said. "Beyond that, it's uncharted waters." Smith nodded, his jaw tight. Better uncharted waters than a forest full of the dead. Sarah appeared at his side, her face pale but resolute. "The villagers are asking what happens next." "They're scared, Captain." "Scared is good," Smith replied, his voice low. "It means they'll stay alert. Complacency will get us killed." She frowned. "We need more than fear. We need a plan." Smith turned to her, his expression hard but not unkind. "We'll find a safe place to land. Somewhere defensible. Somewhere the dead can't follow." "And if there isn't such a place?" Sarah asked. "Then we make one," the scout interjected. Below deck, the villagers huddled together in the dim light of lanterns. The children clung to their mothers, their wide eyes darting at every creak of the ship. Graves' widow sat in the corner, clutching her husband's broken hatchet. "We'll never be safe," she muttered, her voice trembling. "They'll find us. They always do." "Stop that," an older man snapped. "You'll scare the children." "She's right," another woman said, her arms wrapped protectively around her son. "They don't stop. They don't tire. How can we fight something like that?" "We have to trust Captain Smith," the scout said as he descended the stairs. His voice carried a calm authority that silenced the murmurs. "He got us this far. He'll get us the rest of the way." Above deck, the first stars began to appear. Smith scanned the coastline through his spyglass, searching for any sign of the undead. He lowered the glass and sighed. "How's the morale below?" he asked as the scout joined him. "Fragile," the scout replied. "But holding." Smith glanced at the villagers, their faces pale and drawn. "We need a victory. Something to give them hope." The scout nodded. "And fast." Their conversation was interrupted by a shout from the crow's nest. "Ship ahead." Smith grabbed the spyglass and focused on the distant silhouette. It was another vessel, larger than theirs and drifting aimlessly. The sails were torn, and no lights burned on its deck. "Could be survivors," Sarah said, appearing at Smith's side. "Or worse," the scout muttered. Smith lowered the glass. "We can't ignore it. If there are people aboard, they'll need our help." The ship altered course, steering toward the derelict vessel. As they drew closer, the air grew heavy with the stench of decay. The villagers huddled at the rail, whispering nervously. "Something's wrong," Sarah said, her hand gripping the hilt of a dagger she'd taken from one of the fallen. Smith nodded grimly. "Prepare to board," he ordered. The scout assembled a small group, each armed with whatever weapons they could find. They lowered a rowboat and paddled toward the drifting ship. The derelict was eerily silent as they climbed aboard. The deck was slick with blood, and broken barrels and crates lay scattered. Smith motioned for the group to spread out, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. "Stay sharp," he whispered. They moved cautiously, the silence pressing down on them like a weight. The scout led the way, his bow drawn and an arrow nocked. Sarah followed, her dagger at the ready. In the captain's quarters, they found the first body. The man was slumped over his desk, a bloody handprint smeared across the wood. His face was contorted in agony, and bite marks marred his neck. "Zombies," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not just zombies," the scout said, pointing to a shattered window. "Something else was here." Smith examined the body, his expression grim. They didn't stand a chance. A low growl echoed through the ship, freezing them in place. The sound grew louder, followed by the shuffle of footsteps. "They're here," the scout said, his voice tense. The group formed a defensive circle, their weapons ready. The first zombie appeared at the end of the corridor, its rotting face twisted in a snarl. More followed, their movements slow but relentless. "Hold the line," Smith ordered. The fight was brutal and chaotic. The zombies came in waves, their decayed bodies barely slowing down despite the blows they took. Sarah stabbed one in the chest, only to realize too late that it wasn't enough. The creature lunged at her, its jaws snapping inches from her face. The scout's arrow found its mark, sinking into the zombie's skull. "Aim for the head," he shouted. Smith swung his sword in a wide arc, decapitating 2 attackers at once. "Keep moving. Don't let them surround you." The battle spilled onto the deck, the group fighting desperately to hold their ground. One of the villagers screamed as a zombie dragged him overboard, the splash lost in the chaos. "We can't hold them off forever," Sarah yelled, her dagger flashing in the moonlight. "We don't need to," Smith replied. "Just long enough to get back to our ship." The scout spotted a gap in the horde and fired an arrow, clearing the path. "There," he shouted. "Move now." The group made a break for the rowboat, their weapons swinging wildly as they fought their way through. Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on a loose board. A zombie lunged at her, but Smith was there, his sword cleaving through the creature's skull. "Go," he shouted, pulling her to her feet. They reached the rowboat and pushed off, their arms straining against the oars. The zombies gathered at the edge of the derelict ship, their growls fading as the distance grew. The villagers on the main ship cheered as the group climbed aboard, but their relief was short-lived. Smith turned to face them, his expression somber. "That ship wasn't just a wreck," he said. "It was a warning." The villagers fell silent, their faces pale with fear. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. What do we do now? Smith looked out at the horizon, the first hints of dawn beginning to appear. We keep moving, he said. And we stay ready. The ship sailed on, the sunrise offering little comfort as the shadows of the undead loomed ever closer. Chapter 18. The morning sun broke over the sea, casting warm rays onto the battered ship as it creaked toward the shore. For the first time in days, the horizon wasn't marred by smoke or shambling figures. The sight of land, a small inlet with dense forests and a sandy beach, drew gasps of relief from the villagers crowded on deck. "Land," the scout called from the bow, his voice weary but triumphant. John Smith lowered the spyglass and handed it to Sarah. "This is it," he said. "The best chance we'll get." Sarah peered through the glass. A few small huts dotted the shoreline, smoke rising lazily from their chimneys. The people there, Indians by the look of their clothing, seemed peaceful, going about their morning tasks. "Let's hope they're friendly," she said, lowering the spyglass. The ship grounded softly in the shallows, the villagers clambering down with as much grace as their exhaustion allowed. Smith stood at the head of the group, his sword sheathed but his hand hovering near the hilt. A small group of Indians emerged from the tree line, led by an older man, adorned in ceremonial garb. His expression was wary, but not hostile. He raised a hand in greeting. Smith stepped forward, holding his hands out to show he was unarmed. "We come in peace," he said firmly. "We've escaped something terrible. We need refuge." The elder studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You are not safe here." The scout exchanged a glance with Smith. "What does he mean?" Before the elder could answer, a sharp cry came from the village behind them. A woman ran out of one of the huts, clutching a child to her chest. The boy's skin was pale, his eyes glassy. "No," Sarah whispered, her stomach twisting. The elder turned to his people and shouted something in their language. The villagers sprang into action, barricading the huts and arming themselves with spears and bows. "They're here," the elder said grimly. Smith spun toward the forest, just as the first undead figure emerged from the shadows. Its rotting flesh hung in tatters, and its dead eyes locked onto the group. Behind it more followed, their guttural growls growing louder with each step. "Form a line," Smith shouted. "Defend the women and children." The scout notched an arrow and fired, the shaft piercing the first zombie's skull. It crumpled, but the rest kept coming. The battle was chaos. The villagers and Indians fought side by side, their weapons clashing against the relentless horde. Sarah stood back to back with the scout, her dagger flashing as she fended off attackers. "They just keep coming," she shouted. "Then we keep killing," the scout replied, loosing another arrow. Smith waded into the fray, his sword a blur of steel. Each swing brought down another zombie, but for every one he felled, two more seemed to take its place. The elder's voice rang out over the noise. "To the water. They can't follow into deep water." Smith glanced at the retreating villagers, and then back at the horde. "Fall back," he bellowed. "Get to the boats." The group began a chaotic retreat, fighting every step of the way. The scout covered their rear, his arrows finding their marks with deadly precision. Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on a root, but Smith was there to haul her up. "Keep moving," he growled. The villagers reached the boats, shoving them into the water with frantic urgency. The elder helped his people into canoes, barking orders in his native tongue. "Get in," Sarah urged, grabbing a child and lifting him into one of the boats. Smith stayed on the shore, his sword still swinging. "Go," he shouted. "I'll hold them off." The scout grabbed his arm. "You can't fight them all alone." "I'm not alone," Smith said, nodding toward the elder, who had stayed behind with a spear in hand. The two men stood shoulder to shoulder as the undead closed in. The elder's spear flashed, impaling one zombie after another with deadly precision. Smith's sword moved in a relentless rhythm, each strike perfectly timed. But the horde was endless. "Go!" the elder finally shouted. "Your people need you." Smith hesitated, his grip tightening on his sword. Then he nodded and turned, sprinting for the nearest boat. The scout reached out and hauled Smith aboard as the boat pushed off. The undead swarmed the shore, their rotting hands grasping at the water. "Row," Smith barked. The boats glided over the water, the villagers paddling with every ounce of strength they had left. The undead stumbled into the shallows, but stopped short as the water grew deeper, their growls fading into the distance. On the opposite shore, the group collapsed onto the sand, gasping for breath. Sarah sat beside Smith, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "We made it," she said, her voice trembling. "For now," Smith replied, his eyes scanning the forest. The elder approached, his expression grave. "This is not the end. The sickness spreads like fire. It will find us again." Smith nodded. "Then we'll be ready." The villagers began to set up camp, their movements slow but determined. Sarah knelt beside a small fire, tending to a pot of boiling water. "What now?" she asked as Smith joined her. "Now we rebuild," he said. "And we fight. Until there's nothing left to fight for." She nodded, her eyes meeting his. "We'll survive. Together." Smith's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "Together," he agreed. Far across the water, the shambling horde continued its relentless march, their growls echoing into the night. And behind them, unseen by anyone, the infected child shuffled toward the unsuspecting villagers in the distance, his small shadow a harbinger of the nightmare yet to come.